The Mercator projection shows Alaska at 2.5 times its actual proportion relative to the contiguous US. Where it looked like a giant northern continent, it actually fits entirely within the Midwest when scaled correctly. This visual distortion happens because the Mercator projection stretches areas closer to the poles to preserve straight lines for navigation. Watch what happens when we digitally unwrap Alaska from the Mercator distortion. The state's polar regions compress vertically while maintaining their true east-west dimensions. The Aleutian Islands that appeared stretched out on standard maps now show their actual clustered formation. The result is an Alaska that measures approximately 1,400 miles from north to south, not the exaggerated 2,200 miles the projection suggests. This distortion affects how we perceive everything from Alaska's climate to its strategic importance. Most people imagine Alaska as this massive frozen wasteland because maps show it sprawling across the top of our mental image of North America. In reality, Anchorage sits at a lower latitude than Oslo, Norway. The southernmost point of Alaska actually extends further south than London. Consider a traveler flying from Seattle to Anchorage, expecting a cross-continental journey. They're surprised when the flight takes just 3.5 hours, the same duration as Chicago to Los Angeles. If Alaska were truly the size it appears on Mercator maps, that same flight would take nearly 6 hours. Even internal flights defy expectations. Anchorage to Barrow takes less time than crossing Texas. The standard Mercator projection makes Alaska appear to cover about 17% of total U.S. land area, when it actually comprises just 10%. That's a difference of nearly 300,000 square miles in visual representation versus reality. When scaled properly, Alaska could comfortably fit within the combined areas of Texas, California, and Montana. The projection particularly exaggerates northern features like the Brooks Range and North Slope. These areas appear disproportionately large compared to southern Alaska's Panhandle region. In reality, the distance from the Arctic coast to the southern islands is about the same as from Seattle to San Diego, but the map stretches this to look more like Seattle to Mexico City. This distortion affects how we view population distribution too. About half of Alaska's residents live in the Anchorage area, which appears unusually compressed on Mercator maps. The state's road system concentrates in the south near population centers, not spread evenly across the massive landmass the maps suggest exists. The water surrounding Alaska suffers similar exaggeration. The Bering Sea appears impossibly wide on standard maps, when in reality the distance from Nome to Russia's Chukotka Peninsula measures just 55 miles. Commercial shipping lanes follow much more reasonable paths than the sprawling blue expanses on Mercator maps would suggest. Why does this matter? Because our mental maps influence everything from travel plans to resource allocation. Students learning geography absorb the misconception that Alaska is nearly the size of the continental US. Policymakers may overestimate transportation challenges based on the false distances. Even military strategists must compensate for the projection size distortions when calculating response times or supply lines. What's particularly fascinating is how this distortion developed. Gerardus Mercator designed his 1569 projection primarily for nautical navigation, not for political geography. Sailors needed straight lines that maintained constant compass bearings, not accurate landmass proportions. The system worked perfectly for crossing oceans, but accidentally created these size illusions that persist in our collective imagination. Now that you've seen how maps dramatically exaggerate Alaska's size, you'll start noticing similar distortions everywhere. The next section will reveal how Texas, another famously huge state, actually measures up against its international counterparts, proving that sometimes seeing isn't always believing when it comes to world maps. Texas versus Europe. Texas often gets described as enormous, a state so large you could fit multiple European countries inside it. But this idea relies heavily on the distorted perspective created by the Mercator projection. When we compare Texas to Europe using accurate size measurements, the reality looks different. On a standard Mercator map, Texas appears massive compared to France or Spain. But shift to an equal area projection, and Texas measures about 268,524 square miles, only 8% larger than France. The difference isn't nearly as dramatic as most world maps suggest. Picture dragging Texas over Europe like an interactive map overlay. It fits neatly over France with room to spare. The northeast corner reaches Paris while the southern tip grazes Spain's coast. The panhandle extends into Belgium, but doesn't consume it entirely. Spain, though 27% smaller than Texas, fills most of its southern half when adjusted for projection distortion. The Mercator effect becomes clear with city comparisons. Paris to Marseille equals El Paso to Houston in distance. France contains similar climate diversity as Texas, from Mediterranean coasts to alpine regions, despite appearing miniature on distorted maps. Population density reveals more illusions. Texas holds 29.5 million people across its large area, while smaller-looking Spain packs 47 million into less space. Mercator maps make sparse regions appear larger than densely populated ones at similar latitudes. These distortions occur because Mercator stretches areas away from the equator. Texas sits at mid-latitudes where the effect becomes noticeable. Spain suffers particularly. Its southern position gets compressed on the projection. Flight times confirm the truth. Dallas to Paris takes 9.5 hours, similar to Houston to Anchorage. If Texas truly dwarfed France as Mercator suggests, this flight would take much longer. State borders add another layer of distortion. Texas's straight-line boundaries appear rigidly defined, while European countries have irregular shapes. This makes Texas seem more substantial when their total areas differ by small percentages. The oil industry provides concrete examples. The Permian Basin covers 75,000 square miles, equivalent to Tunisia or South Dakota. On Mercator maps, these appear drastically different in scale. Offshore platforms in the Gulf operate across distances similar to North Sea oil fields, yet seem more spread out on standard projections. Climate patterns also reveal the truth. Texas spans multiple zones like France does, from humid subtropical to semi-arid. The actual temperature gradients match European distances rather than continent-sized variations. Transportation infrastructure shows similar scaling. Texas highways cover 80,000 miles, comparable to France's 1.1 million kilometer road network. These serve equivalent needs across similarly sized territories. Historical comparisons help correct misconceptions. The Republic of Texas once claimed 389,000 square miles, still smaller than France and Spain combined. Modern Texas occupies less than half that maximum size. Economic comparisons prove the point. Texas's GDP rivals Canada and Russia, countries that appear giants on Mercator maps but contain mostly uninhabited areas. The distortion makes Texas seem to compete with physically larger territories. Agricultural output provides another reality check. Texas leads the U.S. in cattle with 13 million head, similar to France's 19 million across its slightly smaller area. The comparable densities contradict the visual impression from maps. Technology like the TrueSize.com bypasses Mercator distortion. Dragging Texas over Europe shows it covering France with room to spare. The Panhandle reaches the English Channel, while the Rio Grande Valley barely passes the Pyrenees. This size illusion affects practical decisions. Business leaders might overestimate Texas's logistical challenges relative to European bases. Policymakers could misjudge cross-border issues with Mexico. Even military strategists must compensate when calculating response times. The "everything's bigger in Texas" idea stems partly from map distortions. While indisputably large, its size relative to world regions follows geographic patterns once you remove the projection's artificial enhancement. Understanding these proportions changes global perspectives. Texas remains significant, just not in the grossly inflated way standard maps suggest. Its actual place aligns with major European nations, explaining strong transatlantic ties despite apparent size disparities. The same Mercator effects that stretched Alaska also boost Texas's apparent scale. But Texas's mid-latitude position creates subtler, yet still significant, illusions that reshape our geographic imagination. Greenland's deception. Greenland appears as a massive continent on most world maps, rivaling Africa in size. But this visual representation is completely wrong. The Mercator projection stretches Greenland to appear 14 times larger than its true proportion relative to Africa. In reality, Greenland's 836,000 square miles make it smaller than Algeria or the Democratic Republic of Congo alone. When we remove the Mercator distortion, Greenland shrinks dramatically. Placed over North America, it covers just the area from San Francisco to Denver and from Canada to northern Mexico. The entire island fits within the continental United States with room to spare. Its actual size compares to 3 Texases rather than the Africa-sized behemoth shown on classroom maps. The Mercator projection inflates Greenland because it sits close to the North Pole. The projection stretches polar regions vertically to maintain straight lines for navigation. This makes Greenland appear taller than it actually is while preserving its east-west dimensions. The result looks like a giant landmass when in reality it's about 1/4 the size of Australia. Flight times reveal Greenland's true scale. A direct flight from Copenhagen to Kangerlussuaq takes 4.5 hours, comparable to flying from New York to Los Angeles. If Greenland were truly the size it appears on maps, this flight would take over 15 hours. The actual distances match what you'd expect for its real dimensions rather than the bloated Mercator version. Population distribution further proves the size deception. Greenland has about 56,000 residents scattered along its coasts. At its actual size, the population density matches other Arctic regions like northern Canada or Alaska. I remember a geography teacher once showing us a globe after we'd studied flat maps all semester. The collective gasp when Greenland shrank to its proper proportions still sticks with me. The ice sheet covering Greenland contributes to the size misconception. It appears as an endless white expanse on maps, when in reality it covers about 80% of the island's actual area. This ice would fill the Great Lakes 3 times over. Significant, but not the planet-altering volume the distorted maps suggest. Coastline measurements expose the distortion. Greenland's coastline measures about 27,000 miles on Mercator maps, longer than the Earth's circumference. In reality, its coastline stretches about 24,000 miles when measured properly. The projection stretches every fjord and inlet, making the landmass appear more substantial than it is. The size illusion affects scientific understanding too. Greenland's ice melt contributes to sea level rise, but not at the catastrophic rate the distorted maps might imply. At its true size, complete ice melt would raise global seas by about 24 feet. A serious threat, but not the world flooding scenario the Mercator-inflated version suggests. Historical maps show how the distortion developed. Early cartographers drew Greenland progressively larger as explorers mapped its coasts. The Mercator projection locked in these exaggerations by mathematically stretching polar regions. This same projection quirk affects all high-latitude areas, but Greenland's position makes it the most dramatically misrepresented landmass on Earth. Economic comparisons reveal the truth. Greenland's GDP sits around $3 billion. comparable to small US cities like Toledo or Reno. At actual size, its economy matches other remote Arctic regions with similar populations and resources. Climate patterns reflect the true scale. Greenland's southern tip reaches the latitude of Oslo, not the extreme polar position maps suggest. This means its climate varies from Arctic in the north to subarctic in the south, not uniformly frozen as the stretched Mercator version implies. Military operations demonstrate the actual distances. The U.S. Thule Air Base in northern Greenland lies closer to Moscow than to Washington, D.C., a geographic reality obscured when maps inflate Greenland's size. Strategic calculations must account for these true distances rather than the distorted versions. The size deception persists because digital maps use Mercator tiles. Google Maps and other services adopted this system for smooth zooming, accidentally preserving Greenland's inflated dimensions. Each square tile covers less area near the poles, stacking up to create the size illusion. Educational materials reinforce the misconception. School atlases and classroom maps show the distorted version without explanation. Students grow up believing Greenland rivals Africa in size, rather than fitting comfortably within South America's outline. The persistence of this distortion matters because it shapes global perceptions. People overestimate Greenland's importance in climate systems and geopolitics based on its inflated map presence. Clearing up this misconception helps allocate attention and resources more accurately across the Arctic region. Understanding Greenland's true size changes how we view world geography. Rather than a massive northern continent, it's a large island with specific regional importance. This recalibration helps explain everything from migration patterns to military strategy in the Arctic Circle. The gap between perception and reality here is the largest of any place on our maps, a perfect example of how map projections can deceive us about the world's true proportions.